Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. Welcome back to Justice for All Now. This is your host, Hannah Zuberi. You're watching us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused TV network. You can watch Muslim Network TV on Apple, on Galaxy 19 satellite, Roku TV, and Amazon Fire. So today's episode, we're going to be talking about the psychology of genocide, peeling back some of the layers of, a lot of times we have this stereotype about genocide. And we talk about this a lot. As you know, Justice for All does a lot of work on anti-genocide and genocide prevention. So today with us to have this conversation is Dr. Timothy Horner. He's a faculty member at the Center for Peace and Justice Education at Villanova University. He's received his doctorate from Oxford University, where his doctoral work focused on early Jewish and Christian relations. He also has an Master's in Divinity from the North Park Seminary and a Master's in Jewish Studies from the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. Dr. Horner's teaching focuses on the psychological road to atrocity and genocide. His research studies the perpetrators of violence and how religion in particular plays a role in justifying violence and sometimes genocide. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Dr. Horner.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We, as a little bit about Justice for All, we have been working on anti-genocide work since we started under Bosnia. We started off as the Bosnia Task Force. And over the years, we've worked on Kosovo, we've worked on Burma, what's happening with the Rohingya and with the Uyghurs in China, in occupied East Turkestan is our focus these days. We're also working on anti-fascist work in India. But broadly, Justice for All works in many different capacities, trying, anti-hate speech. But when I heard about your work, I was fascinated because this is a road that we often use, the anti-hate road. But your work has really focused on another aspect of genocide and the perpetuation of hate and the perpetuation of violence, and in a different form than hate. So what I will discuss this but I do want my audience to know a little bit more about you. So could you please tell us more about yourself beyond your role at Villanova? Tell us more. We would like to learn more about the Center for Peace and Justice, what is being taught there. So please do share that with us.
Sure. Well, my context about who I am as a person is intimately intertwined with my study and what I teach. And I don't think that I ever could have come to the kind of place that I am now when I think about genocide and atrocity and sort of organized, structured elimination or disappearance of people, unless I came from the place that I came from. And this is a part of not only who I am. This is not an accident. This is actually crucial to understanding, or for me at least, to be at this place where I am. I grew up. I mean, I'm white. I was raised. And I'm not talking about my parents here. My parents are lovely, lovely people. When I say I was raised, I'm talking about a culture in which I was born into. I was born into a culture as a Christian in the center of America, in a sort of an all-white community, totally homogenous when it came to religious homogeneity. And I grew up really being taught and told that I was a very special person. I was made to colonize other people. Now, they didn't say that word. They said that, but you got the message that I was a special person. I was white, I was male, I had fair skin, fair hair, blue eyes. And there was this kind of fascination growing up in the 70s and after the Holocaust about being the master race. And those messages of being that dominant cultural force, that dominant race in the world, was soaked into me by my culture in very passive ways sometimes, and through the television that I watched and the history that I took in, and the people around me were all echoing this same idea. And there's all this racism and supremacy that was absorbed by me through my culture. And so that curiosity that started young about, I didn't know I was white. This might sound kind of strange, but I didn't know I was white until I was an adult in my early 40s, frankly. Which is to say that I thought I was the normal, typical type of human in the world, and that everyone else in the world was a variation of me. And that was something that was sort of assumed, right? So that sort of narrative about growing up in a culture where you not only think of yourself as the normative human being on the planet, but also the supreme form of that, is a very particular way of growing up. And there are a lot of people in America, a lot of white people in America that still go into their adulthood, not that they're members of the Ku Klux Klan or they're rabid racists that have tattoos or that have these affiliations, but it's in the water, so to speak. And so my story really of what I am doing now is trying to unpack and understand how that mentality was conveyed to me, and the effect that that mentality has had in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the way that this sort of Western perspective of the world has led, I think, to a very particular 20th century phenomenon, which we know as genocide. And that story is not the dominant story about why genocides have occurred. That story about genocides are an aberration of evil. They are a manifestation of hate. They bubble up every once in a while in cultures that have not been civilized, or other cultures that are inherently violent, and that it's this sort of aberration to the human experience, is a narrative that was made mostly, I think, to protect Western white people from a deeper understanding of colonialism, a deeper understanding of the roots of where this impulse to eliminate or disappear groups of people that are different, and where that comes from. And so I've become very skeptical, as you point out in your introduction, very skeptical of that idea that genocide is simply an expression of hate, right? I don't use the words evil, and I don't use the words hate in my classes. And if I do, we seek to understand why we use those words in our culture. And so that's sort of the long view of who I am, and that sort of investigation, which started out to be quite personal, understanding who I am as a person in the culture and the surrounding culture, and the fact that I got exposed to other cultures in my 20s. I spent time in Nigeria and went to Africa, and that sort of was the beginning of a much longer journey to understand who I am on this planet in this moment, and what that has to do. And that was a very different thing than what I had been told growing up. And then I went to Rwanda in 2007 through a group through the Catholic Relief Services. I had just started teaching here at Villanova, and got a chance to go to Rwanda. And I had always been interested in atrocity, especially group atrocity, especially how whole cultures can come to embrace a mentality that sees the elimination of whole groups of people to be the only sensible solution to a particular problem. I must tell you that after 9/11, to watch this country pivot toward war in the midst of, in the wake of 9/11, was something that surprised me. And I'm kind of embarrassed that it surprised me so much, because all of the building blocks were there, but I hadn't seen them. I hadn't noticed them. I didn't know. But then when it actually came about, that was a real turning point for me. And the longer I get from that event, the more I realize how that really turned my whole emphasis away from. I did my doctoral work on the 2nd century, the Common Era. I mean, I was studying how Christians and Jews interacted in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. That's what my study was. I'm a historian and a theologian by trade. But after 9/11, I started to really ask some serious questions about how this can happen, how this phenomenon, this pivot toward war, this sort of these impulses, where are they? How are they constructed? How are they built? How are they perpetuated? How are they enacted within a culture? I saw that unfolding in my own country, and that was a real turning point, and that started to lead on this whole journey, which led me to Rwanda, which led me to study the genocide in Rwanda, first as a curiosity because I was around in 1994 and yet I didn't notice it. I remember being here and not even really even thinking that it had anything to do with me, and then learning the real history of Rwanda and finding out, wow, that had a lot to do with me. How could something that happened in this tiny little country the size of Maryland to have some connection to me? And my course of study led me down some really intimidating, sort of painful rabbit holes. So that has started to unwind in these ideas of colonialism and what colonialism has done and what it is built upon and the premises and the use of religion. And that's the beginning of where I am now. I started teaching this course called the Nature of Genocide in 2009 after I came back from Rwanda, and I've been teaching it every semester here at Villanova since then. And I've done scholarship on the role of religion in Rwanda in the decade.
I want to ask you about that. You went to Rwanda, and after that, I've read about you studied the role of a Rwandan Catholic Church in the decades leading up to the genocide. What were your conclusions and this role of faith and religion in genocide? And you made several points that I definitely want to follow up, and we will, about the rise of these tendencies here in this country. And so, yes, let's talk about Rwanda.
Yeah, Rwanda was a real wake-up experience, not only in understanding the role of colonialism, which is a little, that one is a little easier. That's more intuitive. You don't have to go far. You don't have to dig that deep to realize, to see the kind of agenda that colonialism really has. And we call it civilization, but it is something quite much more aggressive. But what was surprising to me was the way in which Catholic social teaching, and I'm not Catholic myself, I grew up actually as an evangelical. I grew up as an evangelical I went to an evangelical college. I was surrounded by evangelicals / fundamentalists, very strong Christians that were convinced that they were saving the world from evil, that they were saving people from the fires of hell, one soul at a time. And they were convinced, utterly convinced, that they were right. And there are still plenty of people in this country who believe that. But I am no longer in that place. But that is the culture in which I came out of. And so I had this idea that religion was always on the side of good. And so when I started to study colonialism in Rwanda, I realized that you can't study colonialism unless you also study the Catholic Church, or the church that went along with colonialism. And that empire, almost always, and especially in the 20th century or the 18th, 19th, 18th, maybe even 17th century, that empire travels with a religion. It really can't function without a religion. And so to study the role of the Catholic Church in its role in Rwanda was really surprising to me, because I thought that the Catholic Church would be on the side of peace and be on the side of making peace, especially Catholic social teaching, which is premised on these ideas of peacemaking, this sort of always on the side of the downtrodden. But what I saw in Rwanda is the way in which even these noble, and I do see that there is nobility in the tenets of Catholic social teaching to be on the side of those who are downtrodden and the poor and the disenfranchised and those that are put down by domineering governments. But that mentality was actually what was weaponized by Hutu extremism in the wake of the colonial period, and actually used to advocate for violence in the wake of that. And that the genocide was a kind of twisted, distorted justice for the ills of colonialism that went along with the Belgians choosing of the Tutsis to be their colonial leaders on their behalf. And in the period after independence, that mentality that the Tutsis are the colonialists and therefore they need to be punished for their role in colonialism after the Belgians left and the Tutsis were left over. Hutu ideology sort of embraced that idea of reciprocity or justice and weaponized it into a kind of unrecognizable violence that came to characterize the genocide in Rwanda, all using these tools given to them by naive, is the best way to put it, naive Catholics who thought that they were trying to stay in, and trying to make things right. But it was just a reversal of the injustice that was done to the Hutus during the colonial period. And they just reversed it and did the same thing to the Tutsis, but worse. And that was counterintuitive, and that was shocking to me at the time. But I have come to realize and sort of respect the power of religion, but also realize that just because someone says they are religious doesn't tell me that they are on the side of peace.
Side of peace.
And of course, this was all before the rise of ISIS or the rise of terrorist. I mean, I knew about religious terrorist groups, Christian terrorist groups in this country through my study and curiosity about white supremacy, but they have only risen in the past 5-10 years as well. And so the rise of radical religious groups that use religious tenets to sanction violence has become a really, really interesting point to me, simply because it's counterintuitive and that people don't usually think that it's possible, and they see violence and religion as two opposed methods. But in my own study of my own history of Christianity, those two things travel together almost all the time. And so, you go back 1,000 years.
You said something that empire cannot travel without religion. So I wanted you to, if we look at it in today's day and age, where with the term neoliberalism, and there's a lot of, push for secular thought. And then I'm going to also point to perhaps China, which is the Communist Party, has no faith, no religion attached to it, but their empire is spreading, and and anyone who seems to be in their path right now is actively going through what we believe is a genocide. Scholars are still debating it. For example, what's happening to the Uyghurs and the Turkic people. So I'd love to get your thought or commentary on that.
Yeah, China, this is really interesting because you're right. It doesn't seem on the surface like that there is a religion with that empire. We may in fact be seeing something new with China. I am always open to this. One thing I've learned is that we are accelerating on this planet, and just because something happened in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century does not mean that that thing is going to happen in the 21st century. And so I am open to the idea. I mean, what I could do with China is say, well, it's not religion per se, but it's a religion of culture, or it's a cult of personality, or they've turned Han culture into a religion, and it has all the trappings of religion. But what you're doing there is maybe what I would be suspicious of doing is just not being open to the fact that we might be seeing something new in China that we haven't seen before. This kind of overt, I mean, I think the tools of what China is doing, I see echoes of this in previous regimes, previous situations, which I would call genocide, which other cultures, mostly including my own. So I just want to be clear. I mean, when I'm talking about China, if I talk about I say Uyghurs, but that might be a different pronunciation. But when I see the treatment of Uyghurs, it rings all sorts of bells in my own tradition about the way Europeans and then Americans treated Native Americans, the use of reservations, the use of cultural power moves to eliminate the culture of people that didn't fit in. And there's many of the same kinds of tactics that were used on indigenous peoples in my country. I see the resonance happening to this in Xinjiang province. So they ring all sorts of bells, but there are also new things that Chinese are coming up with that I've never seen before. I mean, the residence program that came out in 2018, I've never seen anything like that in history before, where you have people embedded within the homes of Uyghurs to monitor or do detective work or to try to catch out families that are expressing their culture. Whether that's a religious culture or any culture is almost irrelevant to these people. And that program, I don't see any real precedent for that in history. That might be just
for
new.
audience who might not be familiar with this, what we're talking about, and we've talked about this in previous programs, is the actual embedding of Chinese Communist Party members into Uyghur homes and other Turkic homes, where they are now your relatives. And you treat them, this is this is a woman, she's your aunt, or she's like your mother-in-law, and this is a man, and he's like your husband, and they live in the homes with you. And some of this is state-sanctioned rape. Some of it is thought policing of a kind that this world may have never experienced before, like Dr. Horner is talking about, is where if you're even thinking for a moment and quiet and contemplating, they will ask you, are you thinking about God? Mm-hmm. What are you thinking now? This sort of, and in your own private space. So this is something that definitely the world has never seen. I really am interested in some of the work that you have done in the course that you teach, the nature of genocide and the causes of genocide and human atrocity, because to do this work day in and out, to study it, to follow it, to talk about it, to write about it, to lobby Congress about it, this, and we also a lot of times fall into that conventional wisdom that people kill because they hate. So you believe this assumption is flawed. Can you tell us more about that?
I do. It's not flawed. It's just, it stops too soon. I think we tend to stop. We say, well, what we say is never again, which is ridiculous, because we just keep chanting that and never doing anything about it, as though it has some sort of magical qualities to it. But we also say, things like stop the hate, or it's hate. And then if you always notice, there's never anything that comes after that. My question and what I want, like, I'm like a curious 3-year-old. I'm like, where does the hate come from? Right? I think people just too soon they just assume that hate is this sort of naturally occurring thing, which just is a part of human experience, and there's nothing more to say about it. We just have to stop the hate. But for me, that is only the beginning of the question of where hate comes from. And my own sort of investigation of this has revealed something that most genocides are not committed by people who hate their target. That hate is a kind of, I even disagree with psychologists who talk about hate as a primal emotion. I'd be willing to go head to head with them to challenge them on this, because what hate looks like on the ground is not so much about hating another person, but seeing them as an obstacle to something. That what you see when you study genocide or génocidaire or people who perpetrate genocide is a kind of deep and lasting frustration that comes because people want something that they cannot have. And they are told that the thing they want can only be had if they remove certain obstacles to that vision. And usually the vision in genocides is a utopian vision. That utopia actually is the one thing that I get most nervous about when I see it. Was one of those early warning flags that sort of go off in my head when I hear other people or regimes or ideologies. If they start holding utopian visions in front of their people and saying, you can have this is possible, if only these people will disappear, if only we get rid of this group of people, then we will be able to have these utopian situations. That to me is the beginning of genocide. So anger is a form of frustration that comes when people don't get out of the way, when people stick around and don't just leave because you want them to, right? And so that anger is a form of frustration that comes because you want something that you can't have. And so it's less about the people themselves Although I think that frustration always has to be justified. We always have to come up with narratives that explain why those people shouldn't have the same thing we have, or why their voices don't count, or why they are not as important, or more popularly, why they are so dangerous, why they must be removed, why they are existential threats to our existence. These are in the later stages of genocidal ideology. You always hear this: if these people continue, we will cease to exist. They are a threat to us, and they are a threat to you and your family, and all that kind of rhetoric. And the extent to which people buy into that utopian vision of the future, this is what worries me so much about China, is there's so much utopian dreams behind this. It worries me about America. It worries me about any other culture that promises these kind of earthly utopian visions. That these set up the stage for frustration, the kind of frustration that leads people to come up with narratives that justify their violent inclinations to eliminate people so that they can have these utopian dreams.
And ISIS did this. We saw this in ISIS when ISIS promised a caliphate and things that I know as a Muslim, I was watching that saying, you know, what is this?
Right.
Like this extreme disgust and recoiling, because it seemed nothing like the religion we have been taught and studied. And I'm seeing this in India in a way that is egregious to the and it's coming side by side with an economic downfall that perhaps that we hadn't seen in India for a while, and especially with the rise of the BJP party and the Russia Soik Sevam Sangh and their utopian vision of a Hindu nation. And
right. I think we're just now at the beginning. Actually, this is, I hate to even say this, but I think we are just at the beginning of this phenomenon. It's a different kind of nationalism than just the kind of nationalism that is based on European borders, right? Or anything. That those delineations of nationhood, the establishment of nationhood based on that are crumbling in many cases, and borders are crumbling in many cases. But that doesn't mean that people are going to just have this kumbaya moment and all come together as one great human family. And in fact, the sort of and this is where we get into very human territory. Like, it's no accident that you see this cross-culturally, across time. But there's something distinct about what's happening now in this moment of human history, that we are feeling more crowded together than we ever have been in human history. I mean, there are always places where people feel they're bumping up against one another. There are always borderlands, right? There's always intersectionality between groups coming together and sort of facing that. But I don't think we've ever experienced that on the scale and the scope that we have now. Mostly because of our communication across these lines is so great, is so easy, is so quick that our perception is skewing, and we're feeling invaded, even if we aren't. Even if we're not being invaded, we feel invaded by an onslaught of messaging that taps into this very human desire to be safe, and how we are safe is dependent on whether we're people we trust. And whether we're with people we trust, we have to know, how do we trust one another? What criteria do we use to trust one another? And for the most part in human history, we have used visual appearances as that first line of indications about who we can trust. How they look, how they dress, what language they speak, how do they posture themselves, what food do they eat, how do they live. Those have been the things that, for the most part, have been fairly successful as a first line of defense about who people really are. But those lines are being challenged by the modern world. And so, though we're still sort of in this not medieval, I think it's even primeval, we just can't seem to evolve fast enough or change fast enough to adapt to these very old human habits of how do we know who to trust. And there are groups that have learned how to weaponize that instability and weaponize that fear of insecurity and tap into that in ways that galvanize people toward these utopian visions of promises of safety sameness and all of these things which make us feel safe on the surface. I think one of the great things that's happened in the modern world is that we've discovered that those criteria don't work. Right? So you can have someone that looks like you, speaks the same language as you, eats the same food as you, acts like you, has very different motives for you. And that has been, I think that is part of the situation we find ourselves in the modern world, is what do we do with this? How do we navigate this sort of new global connectivity in the wake of these sort of very basic premises? And I don't fault our premise to want safety. I don't hold any of us. There's nothing wrong with that, and I don't think that we're ever going to get around that. But I think how we negotiate the bounds of how we are connected is one of those things that is up for grabs. I mean, the fact that I'm on your channel at all is a testament to how those lines are people are starting to renegotiate those lines about what connects us. Because even within my lifetime, I would never have imagined that I would be on a show like this, talking about this, because of how isolated we all were from each other. Even within the last 50, 70 years, it has just been an explosion of exposure. And so I'm sympathetic to us as a people, as a species, as human beings. I'm sympathetic, but I also we need to be very wary of how vulnerable we are to people who can tap into those insecurities and sort of bring out those qualities in us that end in the destruction of people and the deep regret and trauma that follows that, not only for the people that are killed and the survivors, but also of perpetrators. I live in a culture, a white Western culture, that has been traumatized by itself, and we don't know it yet. We are living in a state of ignorance still about the trauma that we have self-inflicted on ourselves by this agenda of homogenizing the world, or what we call civilizing the world. That has different kinds of trauma attached to it. And we just aren't aware of how much we have traumatized ourselves. And we are only starting to get to tap into that.
You said something earlier as well, like the connections that are made, like social media plays a vital role in this. I mean, we're recently had congressional hearings on Facebook and Twitter and their role in many things, including in the Rohingya people. I know have sent representatives to Facebook about their role in this genocide. So as it connects us, like it's connected us, and it also tends to make us into these bubbles where we're just living in that yes, I'm going to be able to achieve this utopia because there's so many more that are being. So what are some of the things that people that realizing this and addressing this, what is something that people who are working for peace and justice can use to push back against this? Because just as they have they're using that tool to divide, and how can it be used against genocide?
That is such a great question. That is, it's such a fraught question, right? Because it has as your comment points out, you're seeing both sides of that sword. It cuts both ways. The problem is the solution, and the solution is the problem at the same time right now, right? So I think how do we use the very thing that, my students talk about how Instagram is so toxic and how it's so difficult, and yet they're captives to it, right? That they can't stay off of it. And yet they also are seeing worlds that they would have never had exposure to had it not been for things like Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Although none of my students are on Facebook anymore. It's just for old people. But so yes, there is this. How can we do that? How can we utilize that? I think what I fall back on in times like this, where we're faced with these are problems that the human family has never had to deal with before. This is a completely novel problem, right? So we don't have any tools in our toolkit that sort of directly do that. So we need to think, okay, what tools do we have that could be repurposed. And this is what we're very good at as human beings, right? Using the tools that we have to repurpose them for modern purposes. We're very, very good at problem solving. And one of the things that I think that we can do and that we're very good at, and sometimes we're at the mercy of, is that and I think you use the word in your comments, is connected. That there's something that happens to us when we get into proximity with people, regardless of who they are. My personal thing is once we look into the eyes of other people, I think there is something profound that happens to us when we connect with people by being in their presence and by looking at them in their eyes. And I think there's something that is deeper than, it's not just like a pseudoscience thing. I think there's something very real about that. There's something very chemical about that. But the problem is that we don't have very many occasions for that kind of proximity. We don't have the occasions like we have to sort of talk with one another in extended ways. We have short clipped things where we are not really engaging with human beings. We are engaging with videos, we are engaging with pictures. And so we don't have the feeling that we are actually engaging with a real person. But it's a verisimilitude, right? It's a sort of connection. So I'm very curious. I was actually scouring just recently in the run up to this interview. I was sort of scouring, trying to find out about this residence program that we mentioned earlier. And my guess, I couldn't really find much else about it. Here's what I predict, and I may be wrong on this, but I think that they're going to abandon that program. And it's not because they think that it doesn't work, but I think what they're probably finding is that the people that the Chinese people they're putting in these houses, that they are expecting to be their detectives, expecting to be their reformers, are actually failing miserably. And that what they're finding is that these people they're actually becoming embedded, and they're actually becoming empathic, and they're actually maybe becoming sympathetic, or it's not working because they're not getting enough information about it, because the people that are actually living in proximity to these other people start to see them as human beings, not obstacles toward a utopia, and find it more difficult to do their work. This is what we haven't found out yet, but I am predicting, if we are all human beings and we find ourselves in proximity with other human beings, even if they are different from us, and we connect with them, even if it's under the rubric of something as harsh and aggressive as the residence program, where they are out to find out who the troublemakers are, to change them or root out any sign of their cultural manifestations. I think that the power of human connection is even more powerful than that. And I think that they'll find that out, and they'll try and institutionalize things that are more distant. This is what you see in the camps. This is what you see in the camps, where it's much more distant. It's much more. This is the model that has been most effective in instituting instances of mass atrocity or mass incarceration, enculturation, mass cultural genocide, which is the erasure of a culture, of a people, which is another way of getting rid of those people. That those things have to be removed from them, because if you engage with people personally, we find it extremely hard to be violent toward those people. And the extent, and this is what's characterization about the 20th century, is the extent to which we have been able to industrialize the mass elimination of people in ways that we were not previously able to do in previous centuries, which is why I think and there's other reasons about democracy and other things I could get into, but I think it's one of the distinctive things about why I can say that genocides, as we know them now, are something that we could date from the late 19th and all through the 20th century, precisely because of the way that things were institutionalized. Now, Rwanda is different in a way because it was so visceral, because you had people doing the killing right there, killing their neighbors, killing their spouse, killing children. I mean, all of the things that sort of challenge that. And I also want to honor that as well, because that was an instance where the fear and if you isolate a people and you take away their source of any other viewpoint of the world, if you isolate their news, if you can convince us, not they, us, you can convince us to do anything if you control the media, if you control the worldview of people, and you can convince them that they are on the brink of being eliminated, and that the only action is a defensive one to kill all of the people who are going to kill you. And we have a lot of empathy in human societies for people who are acting defensively. And if you talk to Tutsis, if you talk to perpetrators, they will say, I was defending myself. I
Mm.
believe there was going to be a genocide, not of the Tutsi, but of the Hutu.
Mm.
If you talk to ISIS, they will say, I am defending Islam. I didn't want to do this. No one likes to kill, but it must be done.
Mm.
So there's this.
Is that what you mean when you say think genocidally? That,
Yes, that is a kind of an expedient way that when I think we have in our culture this idea that there's something about human nature that enjoys killing.
mm,
There's a kind of an evil side to us that enjoys killing, or that once you get a taste for it, you do the. You can certainly traumatize people into becoming numb
mm,
to killing, and you could traumatize them, but let me talk to them 3 years after they are done with that, and I will show you someone who has been deeply compromised and deeply traumatized and can never go back to living life the way they were before. This is done to children with child soldiers, and they're never the same. So we can traumatize each other to shut down those avenues of empathy, but you have to really work hard to do that. I mean, that has to be done through violence. That is not our natural state. And so, yes, that's what I mean. Like thinking genocidally is getting to the place where you see other people as an obstacle to your own utopian dreams, or in more acute terms, your own survival. That's truly thinking genocidally. And I know it's hard for us to think this, especially when we talk about the Nazis, but there were, I mean, that was the way it was framed, and
mm,
that people signed on to it. And there were all sorts of anti-Semitism that was already within German culture, so it's not like they just invented it whole cloth. Just like there's no way that we could just invent Islamophobia at 9/11. There were all sorts of signs that were already there. And Islamophobia is probably the most prevalent form of actionable fear that is being acted on in the world today. Um,
and we see,
Anti-Semitism is all over. It's sort of woven into Western civilization, but Islamophobia is being enacted in more places on the planet right now than I can think of any other particular group.
and tying that in with the war on terror and using that to that fear, sparking that fear in people.
Right.
As what you say, like that's one of your conclusion, is the roots of genocide are found in our ability to love deeply. So
Right.
let's talk about that a little bit, because that sort of ties into when you, for me, that ties into why it's been so successful to use the war on terror when people are afraid for their own loved ones, and they believe that this other is going to come and harm them. Then it's easy to convince them to wipe out that other.
Sure. Right. And this is about the larger story of who we are as human beings, and what makes us distinctive is our ability to bond so deeply to one another, is our ability to, and again, this is countercultural, right? I mean, at least in America, we're told that sort of human beings are ruthless and selfish, and that they want what they want. And even if they're altruistic and do things, it's only because they get something in return. And, and all this is a trope that comes, for the most part, it has traveled with Christianity. This is part of the Christian construction of the world about original sin, and that we're really bad people at our root, but we can be corrected if we have divine intervention, and those kinds of models are quite common. But that idea that we love so deeply, that we will do anything to protect those people that we love, again, that's where I get caught up in. That's such a beautiful idea. And there's a part of me that responds deeply to that. I have children, right? I have family. I know what that feels like. And I know how biased I am when it comes to having to make terrible choices about if someone was to choose, could I love everyone equally? I come up short. The whole definition of human love is based on a bias. It's based on that we care for certain people in special ways, and we call that special way love. And if we didn't have that, we would treat all people equally. We hold that up as an ideal, and yet I don't think people really measure what that would look like for us to treat all people equally, because it would mean that we would not love anyone. And I know that's kind of a mind game, but I think it's really important, because I think we need to be really reasonable about what we can expect and what we should be shooting for. And I think when we hold out these dreams of, when we say never again, that's a utopian idea. That's a very dangerous utopian idea, because it takes our eye off the ball. It doesn't allow us to look and see the roots of genocide in ourselves, not just in the hearts of other people that we don't like, not just in the hearts of other people that we don't know, but where they are in each one of us. And I know this sounds kind of psychological, but you can show this from the historical record. You can show this from neuroscience. You can show this from sociological stuff. You can show this from all sorts of angles. This is this idea that seems to just be confirming itself over and over again.
So how do we use that idea to prevent this from happening?
Right.
Like, if that is the root, that this is, you love so deeply that you do anything to protect the ones you love.
Okay, so let me just for the sake of argumentation, we were talking about China. All right. So then I said, the question is does this scale up? Right. So then the question is what does China love? What is China? Who is China's family? Right? Because if we love if we want to stay attached to the people that we love, if we want to stay then if it's not true, then it's got to be true at the grand scale. And if it's not true, then maybe the whole idea is flawed. But I think that one of the things I think that anthropological view that people are selfish, we have translated that into that nations are selfish, just like people are selfish. And I don't think that that's true. And I think what we can do is how you can use these sort of human impulses in something as large and complex as the sort of the cultural agenda that of the Han culture that you see in China. And China's unapologetic about it. It's not like they're trying to hide it. Although I think that there has been the scrutiny that has been put on China because of what they are doing with the Uyghurs and Myanmar with Rohingya, that has actually changed the trajectory. And for me, that's very telling, because that means that there is a soft spot, that they do care about their place in the world, that they do think of themselves as part of a global family. Now, I know they feel beleaguered. I know that they feel put upon. I know that they feel victimized, and that's part of the rhetoric. But that doesn't mean that they do not want to be a part. And I think the pressure that we as outside countries is to be smart and to outsmart genocide, or to outsmart genocidal actions that seek to eliminate people. My goal in all of this is the free expression of the diversity of the human species in community with other expressions of the human species in ways that allow us to expand instead of contract. That's the sort of the goal. But that's all premised on this idea that we all have people that we count as family. And I actually think that that's true for China. And the reason I think it's true is because there has been, and right now what we're seeing is a defensiveness on China's part. They're covering up more. They're trying to hide. They're trying to repress. But that tells me that they know that something is wrong with what they're doing. They know that what they're doing is not acceptable to the people that they care about. Because if they didn't care what the rest of the world thought, they would say, "Oh, yes, come, bring in the inspectors. We don't care what you see us doing to the Uyghurs." They do.
There is a question. We have a question from the audience.
Oh, shoot.
Is there more inclination for the love fueling genocide on a national scale in a collective or individualistic culture?
Well, this is a balance, right? Because collectivism has had a bad name, mostly because it's been abused. Because I think we are entering, and I said this earlier, I think we're entering a new chapter of our human experience where we're going to have to use different tools to try to get the balance right. I think there is a balance, like a thermostat in a house that turns on and off when it senses something is out of whack, and then it compensates, and then we swing to the other side. And I think we're always engaged in getting that balance. And that question is interestingly framed between collectivism and individualism. If you have no individualism, then you lose individual agency. And everything I'm talking about here is premised on the value that we have when it comes to our own individual agency, our feeling of being a part of something larger. therein is the tension, right? Because we want to be a part of something bigger, but we want to feel like we're a part of that thing on our own terms.
Or not on someone.
In that is the tension between collectivism and individualism. I think right now in my country, in the United States, we have been swept away by a kind of individualism in the last 70 or 80 years that we've lost sight of the value of collectivism. It has been vilified. It has been demonized. It's been called socialism or communism. And so it's been pitted against this sort of strict individualism. But I think we are moving, and I see this in my younger students, we are moving into a new, I think, hopefully a new sort of adjustment to that balance. That balance should always be in tension. I know this sounds like such an academic answer to a very honest question, but I would not want to choose between one or the other because each one of those are utopian. Mm. And somewhere in the middle of that is this sort of and how do you keep the balance right? You have to always be in communication and community with other people who don't think and act like you.
And we will have to work harder now with this pandemic to do that. To make it has to be intentional, and I think one of the repercussions and also like a reaction to this has been, I do not want to engage. I should not have to educate anybody about, your hatred towards me. Go learn it yourself. That sort of I've heard that so much, especially in social justice circles, and maybe it's time to move away a little bit from that, because that's not bearing fruit. It's just causing a greater divide. Yeah. And maybe it is sort of playing to the perpetuators of the violence and, babying them in some ways. And should it be should that load be carried by the people who are victims of the violence?
No, it should not at all. And I think this is you've touched on an interesting point that always comes up in my class, is when you seek to understand perpetrators, you feel we talk about the difference between empathy and sympathy, right? There's this danger of, once you understand perpetrators and once you stop saying that it's all about hate and you start identifying their fears, their insecurities, you have this tendency that you want to feel for them. Mm. And that is a very different thing than sanctioning that violence. And I think there's different roles for different people in different cultures at different times. So I can only speak for myself as a white, Western, Christianized male, right? That my work might be different from your work within your community. And my work might look very different from your work in your community. So my work is much more about engaging with other white, Westernized people to get them to do some of that work, to pick up some of that burden that we have classically left for people who we've run over. And then we look back and we say, well, see if you can get up. Right? And so we leave it to Black Lives Matters, and we leave it to people to advocate for themselves and to do their own work when we were the ones that put them in this situation in the first place. So my work within the white community, within the white Western colonizer community, is very different from someone who's within a group of a Latinx non-documented worker in the United States. Right? Their work might be very different. So I don't want to come across saying that everybody needs to look inside and look for the perpetrator within. That's my work. I mean, that might be the work of governments. That might be the work of cultures who have engaged in this kind of eliminationist endeavor, and the kind of stories they tell their children about why those things happened can be extremely dangerous and toxic. That's my tradition. But that's my work, and I don't claim to make that anyone else's work than my own. So this is the point in time which I've been born. This is the privilege that I have had to be able to encounter people who are so different from myself and be able to learn from them, to unveil this web of I don't want to say deception, but it feels like deception about who I was, being lied to about who I am as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual white male. I was told a lot of lies about who I was, about that. And so I'm trying to undo that. So work
and reverse some of those lies, or unveil them and work towards healing from that. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Horner. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we're really grateful for you to be here. And maybe we'll do a follow-up because there's so much left unsaid and uncovered. And but thank you so much. And we're out of time today, but
I can't believe we're out of time.
yes.
So,
No,
I'm sorry. I apologize. This is what I do for a living. So
thank you so much for your sharing your thoughts with us. And those of you who are watching, do follow Dr. Horner's work at Villanova at the Center of Peace and Justice. And from all of us here at Justice for All, thank you for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.